everyone, and welcome to this session, to the 2021 Burton Clark Lecture, which will be given today by Roberta Bassett, who's the Global Lead for Tertiary Education and Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this session. I'm Ellen Hazelkorn. I'm Emeritus Professor at the Technological University in Dublin. I'm a member of the CGHE Research Management Committee and of the board itself. So before I officially introduce Roberta, I want to say a few words about Burton Clark. I'm sure many of you have read all his works, but for those who may not be so familiar, just to say this is the Burton R Clark Lecture. It's an annual lecture on higher education, and it was established by the UCL Institute of Education on the basis of a generous donation by Adele Clark, the widow of Burton Clark, often referred to as Bob by his friends, who died in 2009. Bob Clark was a US leading scholar in the field of higher education studies and a notable contributor to comparative understanding of higher education. His ideas have come to shape the outlook of students and university leaders across the world. His principal works include the higher education system in 1983 and creating entrepreneurial universities in 1998. So now to the business of the hour. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Roberta Bassett, whom I've known for a long number of years. As Global Lead for Tertiary Education at the World Bank, she's one of the few women to hold such a position. She leads the bank's reform efforts, addressing issues such as equity and inclusion, finance, governance, quality assurance, internationalization, research, innovation, competitiveness, skills and outcomes, and remote delivery and learning. Before joining the bank, Roberta worked for many years in both university administration and academia, having served in such roles as lecturer in higher education management and policy at the University of Southampton in the UK, and assistant dean for continuing studies in the summer session at Stanford. She's currently serving as a guest lecturer in international higher education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Roberta is the author or editor of several books and articles in the field of international higher education and holds a PhD from the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, an MA from Stanford, and a bachelor's from Columbia. So it is with my great pleasure that I now welcome Roberta for her Burton Clark Lecture.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and to have you as my chair today. I'm less nervous because you're here. First, I'd like to express my thanks to Claire and Simon for extending this invitation to me. I know I'm an unorthodox choice for this academic lecture series of such renown in our field. So being a non-academic to deliver a keynote address like this might seem a bit risky, but I will do my best to justify their faith in me and offer an unexpected, perhaps, perspective on this topic of this event. So I would also wish to give thanks to Adele Clark for supporting the series of annual lectures on higher education as an important global enterprise. I have no doubt the depth of Mrs. Clark's knowledge of higher education would rival that of anyone participating in this event today. Much like Dr. Edith Altbach, the wife of my mentor and dear friend Philip Altbach, Adele Clark played an instrumental role in editing and critiquing the work of her husband. And proof of her impact is in the pudding, as they say. Clark's work on higher education endure as foundational knowledge pieces in our field. This talk will mainly focus on tertiary education systems, the holistic whole that encompasses all formal post-secondary education. And it is in large measure because of Burton Clark and his peers that we have the foundations upon which to build tertiary education systems that can serve the evolving and often fickle expectations of society. As a policy advisor, I come at this discourse from a macro perspective, independent of institutions and governance. And that perspective will frame my lecture, which is centered on the theme of this conference, Remaking Higher Education for a More Equal World. It is structured in 4 parts. most of which, to varying degrees, utilize the wisdom of Burton Clark as conceptual frameworks. I will first contextualize the impact of higher education on the individual by briefly discussing my own experience in higher education, which has been the most transformative and consistently present element in my life to date. Next, I will shift the discussion from the individual to the system and feature elements of the upcoming World Bank advisory piece on education, which aims to offer policy practitioners a framework for steering their tertiary education sectors through this uncertain time. Part 3 will illustrate the application of the World Bank's framework to global higher education today as a result of COVID-19 and the changes brought by rapid adaptation to nearly catastrophic disruption, and in spite of these COVID-19 impacts as well. And part 4 will close with some brief ideas on the signal, what higher education should be doing as drivers of equity, and the noise, all the rhetoric and historical baggage and political posturing regarding what's coming for global higher education. I will begin my lecture today with a bit of background to frame both my presence here and the context of the World Bank's efforts to be a force for positive and sustainable and equitable reforms in global higher education. So a bit about me then, and the path that brought me to a long and incredibly fulfilling career in international higher education. I have to start by mentioning my parents, oddly enough. My mother is from Thailand and met my father while he was stationed there during the Vietnam War. They married and my mother reluctantly emigrated from Thailand to the United States, where I was born and raised. I am a biracial daughter of an immigrant mother from a country that she revered. Neither of my parents had attended university, and the town where I was raised was overwhelmingly white and working class. Recently, I began to teach again, which has been a wonderful addition to my work life. And in this teaching, I have found students are particularly interested in who we are, what our background is. And so these characteristics for me are the most crucial to understanding the road that I've traveled. For as long as I can remember, I dreamed and prepared for international life, whether that was to take me back to my ancestral homeland of Thailand or to become a diplomat, which was my career goal that I listed in my high school yearbook. I never doubted I would do something global. I suspect for many people tuning in today, no matter your country of origin or your socioeconomic background, this was true for you too. I also had a very stereotypical tiger mother for whom top grades and the commitment to education were everything. And a dad who backed her up, but who softened her edges. I was a very lucky kid. So I took all of these bits and pieces and found my way to an Ivy League university, which guaranteed full need-based financial aid, marking the first moment when a higher education policy gave me access to a life-changing tool. Columbia gave me an education that far exceeded what I had imagined and the social capital to make the most of it. And the transformative power of higher education was cemented into my core values. I am one example of the social mobility the promise of higher education is meant to deliver, and I'm aware of that every day. At Stanford University, I studied for a master's degree in higher education, and the anecdote of that choice offers a snapshot on the slow but steady evolution of the field of international higher education. In the mid-1990s, there were very few places to study higher education in an international context. Stanford was not one of them. When I submitted my application to the education school, I wrote that I wished to enroll in the international education and higher education programs in some hybrid form. And shortly after sending in my application, I received a phone call from Jim Lyons, who's the legendary former dean of students at Stanford University, and at that time, the director of the higher education program. He told me I would have to choose between international higher education, and he hoped I would pick higher education and bring my international perspective to that academic program. Anyone who ever met Jim Lyons would know that the inevitable occurred. Of course, I chose higher education, where I began to look more thoroughly at international issues on a domestic campus. I graduated from Stanford and worked as an assistant dean there for 5 years in student affairs and administration, learning the ins and outs of how a major university was run, amazed at the complexity and the assumptions made about what it takes to educate and build research and create a learning community. I was hooked. Universities are such special places. Who wouldn't want to spend every day around brilliant minds and excited students and libraries and art centers? I still get excited walking onto campuses these many years later. There's nothing like the atmosphere of a university campus. But international higher education continued to call, and eventually I moved east to work and study at Boston College's Center for International Higher Education with Phil Albright, who, when I finished my PhD, introduced me to Jamil Salmi at the World Bank. For the third time, my educational choice shifted my direction, bringing to my life these two extraordinary higher education scholars who continue to inspire, mentor, and support me. I tell this story because for me, my life anecdote encapsulates much of what we hope higher education will do: expand horizons, open up opportunities, create lifelong connections and networks, and build confidence to lead to well-paying and rewarding careers. If it's not already pretty clear, I just love higher education. I know how lucky I am to be in a position to help others improve it, benefit from it, be a part of it, and maybe love it a little bit too. And with this, I will actually move to a slide presentation, so you don't have to look at me talking at you for this entire time. Yeah. So as I've noted, I worked on these slides in 4 parts. I hope this is working. There we go. Okay. So I tried to frame each of my sections with a quote from Burton Clark. In this first one, he noted, and this was in 1987, with each passing decade, a modern or modernizing system of higher education is expected and inspired to do more for other portions of society, organized and unorganized, from strengthening the economy and invigorating government to developing individual talents and personalities and aiding the pursuit of happiness. We also ask that the center of society do more in its own behalf in fulfilling such grand and expanding missions, as conserving the cultural heritage and producing knowledge. The steady accretion of realistic expectations cannot be stopped, let alone reversed. Lastly, last year, roughly 222 million students were enrolled in formal secondary education around the world, more than doubling the 100 million student enrollment figures from the year 2000. It is estimated that there will be 377 million students by 2030, an increase of 281% over the 30 years from 2000, surpassing the growth between 1970 and the year 2000. This growth can be attributed to many factors, including expanded access programs, an increase in the number of providers, both public and private, and greater information on the benefits of achieving post-secondary education. But the simplest answer to the question of why are we seeing such growth is that more students than ever are moving through the education pipeline from primary to secondary into graduation. More students than ever are prepared to continue their studies after secondary education. The tertiary education remains quite a privilege. You'll see in this slide the percentage of 25 to 29-year-olds who have completed at least 4 years of tertiary education by wealth. The rich students, you'll see a progressive steady growth, and by examining the situation among the lowest quintile, the poorest students still are achieving higher education at remarkably and sort of sustainably low or unsustainably low rates. You'll see too that Sub-Saharan Africa has fallen further behind. Almost 3/4 of the expected global growth for the population aged 18 to 23 from 2015 to 2035 will be concentrated in 10 countries: Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Niger, Nigeria, Pakistan, Uganda, and Tanzania. With so much of this growth set to occur in Sub-Saharan Africa, there is an even greater imperative to expand investments and opportunities in tertiary education sectors across the region to maximize the relevant outcomes, advanced skills, and research bring to individuals and societies. Rapid and continuing youth population growth presents a stark challenge for all aforementioned countries and genuinely all governments and tertiary education institutions around the world, particularly in their ability to anticipate and respond to social, political, and economic needs in the decades to come. Promoting tertiary education as a means of addressing key strategic and policy imperatives requires ensuring that tertiary education is suitable for and adaptable to local and global needs. Within this context of massive growth and the pressures faced by every government to build a knowledge society to contribute toward and benefit from the global knowledge economy, The World Bank continues to refine its frameworks for advising countries on how to assess their sectors and design and invest in reforms. So some just key facts about the World Bank's work in tertiary education. Since 2015, the bank has funded more than $9 billion US dollars in investments in tertiary education reforms, making us the largest external financial supporter of the sector globally. We divide our operations across 6 regions, and the majority of our tertiary education lending has been in countries in Africa, followed by Europe and Central Asia and South Asia. Our lending activities are client-driven in that we only develop projects at the request of and in partnership with the borrowing country. We work primarily with governments at the national level, technically with ministries of education, higher education, science, technology, agriculture, medicine, and more, and financially with ministries of finance. Very often, analytical work precedes a lending project by digging deeply into the qualitative and quantitative data of the sector and the national context to determine the more appropriate intervention to design solutions to the problems at hand or the question being asked. World Bank projects are structured around a simple and measurable development objective and implemented by the countries themselves with technical support and project monitoring provided by the World Bank, typically for a duration of 5 to 6 years. This is obviously a tight simplification of a very complex project process, but I'm happy to answer questions on this either after the talk or via email or some other form of follow-up. We have been working on a position paper at the bank to provide a simple guide for both internal and client dialogues on how to focus reform efforts. And we've broken these into 5 main categories: a strategic systems approach, equity, resilience, effectiveness, and technology. In keeping with the theme of this conference, I will focus on the first 3. As Bob Clark said about systems of higher education, systems slide over the long run, along the tracks of elite to mass participation, even if some do not slide very well and stall at minor inclines, relating to more heterogeneous clientele as they include more students drawn from more segments of the population. Input demands multiply, extending the tasks of teaching and increasing the congruences that must be fashioned if individual desires and institutional capabilities are to match. As Bob Clark noted many years ago, tertiary education systems are in constant motion, adapting and evolving to changes in their environment and the clientele. A strategically diversified and flexible tertiary education system is vital for creating the variety of interwoven pathways crucial to meeting the demands and needs of society. An indispensable tool for expanded access and effective learning is the creation and strengthening of a range of post-secondary institutions, such as community colleges, polytechnic institutions, and technical training institutes, with public and private, online and in-person, short course, certification, and full degree options, all of which are part of one single ecosystem, together with universities. Tertiary education systems are characterized and distinguished in multiple ways, including by the issues these systems try to address, such as access and equity, employability, innovation, and the role universities and institutions play in regional development. By the diversity of mission, the balance between teaching and research, the student populations they serve, their relationship with their local community and labor market, and forms of institutional diversity, serving the complex needs of complex societies. By the roles of different actors, such as learners, academics, higher education institutions, ministries, and families. By key instruments like governance and management, financing, and quality assurance. And through the application of distinct tools and the extent to which they endorse and drive new technologies. For students and scholars in North America, this model is pretty familiar, having been in place for more than 100 years in some states and provinces and territories. In other countries, the presence and respect for non-university tertiary institutions, such as polytechnics, further education colleges, and technical training institutes also signify comfort with diversity in post-secondary sector. Students of all ages and levels of preparation have an access point to continue their education within this diverse ecosystem of post-secondary opportunities. For much of the world, however, non-university tertiary education is still minimally developed. And everywhere in the world, there are value judgments made regarding the credentials provided by non-university tertiary education institutions. Changing how cultures value non-university post-secondary learning will be as vital as improving financing and strategic leadership and planning. There is no doubt, however, that this move must take place to absorb the students seeking post-secondary learning and credentials and ensure that the outcomes from that learning are relevant and sustained for the broadest cohort of students and the diverse needs of society. Such diversity of stakeholders and outcomes lead to the next focus of this talk, equity. As Bob Clark said, a national valuation of social justice, fair treatment for all, is pressed upon modern academic systems as a set of issues of equality and equity, first for students and second by faculty, other staff, enterprises, and sectors for themselves. With respect to students, equality is taken to consist in ascending order of stringency of equality of opportunity in the sense of access, equality of opportunity in the sense of treatment once admitted, and equality of outcome or reward. To date, tertiary education expansion has not meant equitable access, even in diversified systems. When systems expand access, the immediate beneficiaries have come from the upper socioeconomic groups, and globally, expansion has occurred in the wealthiest countries. More than anything, these first waves of increased access have largely been a case of finding study places for students who would have been unable to access tertiary education due to a lack of space, not a lack of preparation or connections. And while students from all economic quintiles have been accessing tertiary education in greater numbers, all boats are being lifted, as it were, but some boats are just bigger than others. This predominance of enrollment by the wealthier quintiles in global and local terms can actually be seen as having expanded the equity gap instead of closing it. For policy interventions to work effectively, not only to expand overall numbers, but in purposely closing the equity gap, issues of equity and inclusion must be addressed across three key vertical dimensions: access and enrollment, retention and persistence, and completion and successful transition to postgraduate engagement. In terms of access, examples of measures that have proven effective include outreach programs of information and financial support targeted towards high achievers from disadvantaged groups from the earliest age possible. Retention and creating effective learning environments for at-risk students can be addressed through interventions such as remedial opportunities for students admitted based on potential, but lacking in the preparatory development and skills to succeed in intense post-secondary education, expanded information sharing and outreach from the earliest stages, accessibility of premises and learning materials, and flexibility of provision, bridge programs, adaptation of course design, etc. Horizontal equity considerations, the distribution of students across the breadth of academic fields and institutions must also anchor interventions designed to expand opportunities for all who wish to access them and promote the outcomes sought by graduates, particularly with regard to labor market outcomes that can be evaluated and understood via tools such as graduate tracer studies and labor market forecasting efforts. Equity policies must consider not just improvements in the number of enrolled students, but must also promote access to every possible field of study, especially those most valued by the job market and by graduates. Support for students towards completing their degree programs is imperative. Resilience for equity. The transition to online delivery of teaching and learning exacerbated existing equity concerns and introduced new ones. Tertiary education students who did not have access to adequate resources were confronted by a digital divide, which worsened existing inequalities. Tertiary education systems in some regions were more successful than others in the transition. It is worth noting, however, that internet access is only one consideration in mitigating disparities in online delivery. Reliability, speed, and affordability are critical factors for a virtual academic experience, among many others, and organizations have voiced their concerns about the online transition. The African University Association signaled that among the 700 universities operating in sub-Saharan Africa, very few were well prepared and sufficiently equipped to deliver their programs online. Connectivity remains an issue, and in some countries of the region, governments have difficulties guaranteeing continued power. Further, inequities tend to be interconnected. As such, students who were or became vulnerable due to the online transition likely faced other disadvantages and risks, heightening adverse impacts. For example, in a few countries in East Africa, pregnancy rates for girls in late secondary and tertiary education grew at alarming rates during the pandemic's closures, likely removing a cohort of talented girls from the tertiary education pipeline, at least in the immediate future. Broader economic concerns emerge as young people, particularly in households which experience job loss as a result of COVID-19, may decide to drop out of higher education institutions to find work and support their families. There is a widespread assumption that tertiary education is easily adaptable to remote learning, but why should this be? Students enrolled on relatively well-resourced campuses, fully equipped with technology and infrastructure, return home to the same neighborhoods as their primary and secondary school neighbors. For many places, there is insufficient infrastructure, and homes lack the hardware and connectivity, even private space for distance learning. Moreover, tertiary education is a largely bespoke endeavor where students craft their academic calendar according to their interests and fields of study, and where the quality and opportunities are driven by research infrastructure and direct interactions between research and teaching. Such academic work cannot be delivered by radio or television, unlike at earlier stages of education. Online and distance learning forced massive adaptation for tertiary education institutions regarding how information and coursework is delivered, strongly impacting how and whether students learn. There is, however, an implicit bias in this move, which assumes and requires a level of technical capacity, hardware, and infrastructure that is simply not the reality for students around the world. Again, digital infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, reaches only about 34% of the population. And in many countries on the continent, the rate is much lower. University campuses are also the technology hubs. The loss of one often meant the loss of both. Instead of allowing for broad-scale learning continuity, the move to remote learning left millions of students without any accessible options for continuing their studies after leaving their campuses, widening the achievement gap between those students and the students with the means to keep studying. As evidenced by the pandemic response experience, the focus on reforms for tertiary systems and institutions must include resilience planning at the highest levels, especially for equity challenges. For a social sector system like education, systems resilience can be defined as capacity of an enterprise to survive, adapt, and grow in the face of turbulent change, and the capacity of a system to experience shock while retaining essentially the same function, structure, feedbacks, and therefore identity. Both definitions are relevant to tertiary education systems, which need not simply survive, adapt, and grow in the face of change, but as COVID-19 proved all too clearly, must also know their essential functions and identities, their missions, and their stakeholder communities, in order to sustain those when faced with transformative shocks. Tertiary education systems and institutions must embrace agile frameworks that promote using the shock as an opportunity for reflection, assessment, and evolution in order to maintain commitment to their essential function and identity. That is, there must be adaptation without capitulation. As the history of tertiary education has shown, universities and colleges are among the most resilient institutions on the planet because their value and function remain essential to society. I will close my talk today with opinions and predictions about what the future does and does not hold for tertiary education. This is, of course, a favorite pastime for pundits and academics alike these days. The university remains one of the most venerated and yet simultaneously vilified institutions in modern society. Every country holds its higher education institutions in genuine esteem, aspiring to attend, respecting the academic and administrative professions, enjoying the cultural benefits of living in proximity to these beautiful and almost mysterious places where knowledge is created and merit is valued. And yet universities are a battleground of every generation's culture war. Do they indoctrinate? Do they give advantages to those least in need while exacerbating equity gaps? Are they even necessary? Should the public pay for them? This is the paradox in which we all work and live as we pursue our careers and aspirations in higher education. In this lingering pandemic and the uncertainty that has destabilized so much of our lives and routine, the rhetoric around the future of tertiary education has exploded, in large part because these opinions and editorials do not require research and data to promote, nor is there any accountability. Comparing universities to DVD rental stores or CD players, etc., as if their obsolescence is imminent. But in the day-to-day work with countries around the world, it is clear to me that nothing particularly dramatic looms in the foreseeable future. The signals seem fairly optimistic. First, tertiary education is not in a crisis globally, no matter how many editorials are written about this. There is no new world order for post-secondary education on the horizon. Higher education institutions have been around in some form for over 1,000 years and have been the creators of as much innovation as any other sector could claim. It is worth noting that despite physical shutdowns of university campuses around the world, universities contributed perhaps the most impactful outcome to end the pandemic. Oxford University developed a vaccine using data published on the genome of the coronavirus by a Chinese virologist at Fudan University. This vaccine is the centerpiece of COVAX, the Global Vaccine Initiative, which cites equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines for low to middle income countries as its goal. Likewise, education institutions trained the doctors and the nurses and the medical technicians and many more who helped support and move the countries through the pandemic. Globally, support for university reforms is only growing and at a very rapid pace. There are institutions in the United States that are in dire crisis. Australia as well has been facing some financial challenges due to restrictions on international student enrollments. But the pandemic largely in the United States only magnified existing issues at some institutions. Small private liberal arts colleges dependent on tuition have been closing at rapid rates for the past few decades. And while we mourn the loss of their contributions to the diversity of the sector, the agile higher education marketplace in the United States means students decide if these colleges remain valuable. Some evolve and adapt, some don't. It's a kind of academic Darwinism. Globally, however, closing institutions is not the trend. On the contrary, higher education institutions are exploding in number and diversity of structures and programs around the world. Demand for study places is increasing and the market is responding. Countries need to focus on quality assurance and regulatory frameworks to manage this explosion of institutions, but few are concerned about having too many. Next, digitalization and technology will not solve equity challenges for a generation or more. No matter what you're reading about the transformative power of technology in higher education, it will not be solving equity challenges that students are facing in achieving their tertiary education. Technology is expensive, already a barrier for low-income students. Infrastructure, reliable electricity, ease of accessing clean water, physical space are as important as technology in remote delivery of education. And the world's poor, even if its wealthiest countries, simply do not have the infrastructure to benefit from the wonders of digitalization and remote learning, not without massive economies of scale to significantly drive down the cost to the beneficiaries. Finally, not enough attention is being paid to students, what they want, how they learn. Pundits and policymakers seem to be speaking for students a lot, using anecdotes to represent wholesale demands to be made on their behalf. COVID-19 has made this even noisier. In higher education programs, student development theory, when offered at all as a course, is often separated entirely from education policy programs. Some of the loudest noise in the field of international higher education is about the student experience, yet so little is based on actual research. What we hear when we speak with students around the world in our stakeholder-driven work is that traditional age students want to live with fellow students on or off campus. They want to learn with each other inside and outside the classroom. Those needs and values change, of course, depending on the student cohort being assessed, married students, fully employed students, older students, etc. And these will all have different needs and require different levels of support. A more equal world can be best supported by equitable higher education systems that center their activities around ensuring students have access to and support through the academic program they choose, no matter when in life they have the opportunity. Moreover, authorities in a position to constrain the agility of the system to slide over the long run and respond to the needs of all of its students would do well to recognize the value of these diversified, articulated, and valuable systems that offer a place to as many students as might wish to seek it. I will close with a last quote from Bob Clark on how higher education systems support diversity in experience and values to serve students through their educational journey. Among their institutions, systems can and do proliferate institutional types, arrange the types in function and status hierarchies, and make permeable the boundaries between the sectors so that students can move from one to another in search of different types and levels of training. Diversification is the key to how higher education systems affect compromises among the plurality of existent values. Thank you very much.
Roberta, thank you very much. Lots to think about and questions coming in. And I'll just kind of line up, I've got a couple of questions lined up. And maybe if we start with our first group and then we'll move on to the second. So at the moment, I've got Gerald, Arif, and Ashish. I'm sorry, I don't have your second name. And in the second grouping, if I could prepare you, is Eli Cohn and Phil Outback to come in and look at issues around the system framework. Suitably there, that's great. So can I ask in the first instance, Gerald, if you could unmute yourself rather, and ask your question. There you are, I see you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you, Roberta, for your insights. So as I mentioned on the chat, just would like to understand how the World Bank is currently advising, especially developing countries like Indonesia, on inclusivity for higher education with respect to the role of education technology startups. For example, you mentioned the rapid transformation of going online and the challenges of delivering that quality to remote areas who don't even have electricity or water, to basically using intermediaries to help transform the cultures of universities, which often they don't adapt it fast enough to produce graduates that meet industry needs. Thank you.
And Ashish, you had a question about India? Both questions really dealing with what the bank's approach to certain particular issues are. Jared's in regard to inclusivity, and Ashish was, oh, there you are. Great.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thanks, Ellen, and thank you, Roberta, for your wonderful talk. Very, very engaging. So I'm Ashish Agrawal. I recently moved to India after my stint at doing PhD and postdocs in the US and South Africa. So I'm kind of new to the higher education scenario in India, but I mostly was more curious about the kinds of projects that are being done in India and who are the partner, like, so the kinds of projects that the World Bank is kind of working with, who are the partner institutes, because in my understanding of higher education in India, it's very, very government controlled. And there is a very, very big private sector as well, but that is more around the kind of higher education that small liberal arts schools in the US provide, that is more student fees driven.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Essentially.
Okay. Malee, you want me to take those two?
Yes, please take those two, and then we'll move on to the next group, which are dealing with a slightly different set of issues.
Okay. So I didn't spend a ton of time talking about the World Bank project cycle, which is, I could spend the whole time talking about that. The way we approach our projects, though, are largely driven by the country partnership that the bank has with the government of the country in question. So for our Indonesian colleague, when the World Bank's country team is sitting down with the Ministry of Finance and other leaders, of national leaders, they established working together some strategic focus for the next 5-year period. And in that, especially now in this during COVID, post-COVID world, COVID is high on the agenda. And within that, the adaptation of education also high. Health clearly is at the top of the food chain in how we're engaging with our national governments who are experiencing big COVID shocks. But when it comes to education, the COVID response is the big issue now, and technology clearly is the issue that most countries are asking us for support, at least in assessing what they have. In terms of the digital access point, so you asked a question about ed tech and startups and digital delivery. We are supporting NRENs, the National Research Networking systems that are, it's more of a consortium that exists at the national level, and they exist in countries all over the world. We are doing a lot to work with them because they facilitate both international collaborations, but also they work with mobile providers, internet access providers, et cetera. They work with the digital economy, they work with the universities and other post-secondary institutions. They work with researchers. And so we have found a good avenue in partnerships with supporting NRENs in strengthening their capacity. We have been working also directly with governments in terms of negotiating with mobile providers to improve mostly the cost of data delivery. I mean, in the US and in Europe, mobile phone data is quite inexpensive. In most of our client countries, data on mobile phones is incredibly expensive. And so even working with private providers of internet access has been a big push for us. We don't work with ed tech startups directly. That's not where the World Bank works. We work with ministries of finance, ministries of education. We rarely get granular to the university level as well. The projects support universities. We work with the governments. We do have the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. They support private sector and would work with ed startups like that. Ashish, the kinds of projects of higher education in India, there's a lot of them. It's a massive multi-billion-dollar portfolio in India. I can say, I'll give you an example. We have a huge equity project in the Odisha district that is actually working with the state government, Odisha, to support non-university post-secondary institutions and to expand access. So there's a World Bank office in Delhi. I encourage you to reach out to them to get more information about what happens there, but it's a massive program. Okay, we can move to the next question. Okay. I mean, I could go on forever, but it's too much. I couldn't encompass all of that. So
yeah, no, that was fine. I think, in fact, India may be one of the biggest recipients of World Bank support. So in that case, okay, so let's move on to a kind of a slightly broader issue around the system itself, which comes from two other contributors. Eli Cohn from Imperial wants to ask questions about the polytechnics and convergence, and Phil Albeck on the other side looking at the issue of research universities. And I'll call on Eli first. Are you there?
Hello, thank you.
Oh, there, right, there you go. Right.
Thanks so much for that presentation. I really, really enjoyed getting your perspective. One of your slides mentioned the kind of role of vocational and technical institutions, and you mentioned, for example, the community colleges in the US. And I don't want to bring up a 30-year-old debate now nearly about whether or not there should
I love this debate though, so go ahead.
I know, yeah, but I mean, that's the thing, it is still a debate, and especially in the UK, people on kind of, not exclusively, but mainly kind of to the right politically still want to bring up this debate about whether the UK was right to turn polytechnics into universities. And so yes, and just we're talking about Burton Clark as well. I know he did write about this, but he was kind of, as far as I can see, kind of non-committal on whether or not that was a good thing or not, but he did give an interesting interpretation of it. So I just wonder what your thoughts are, not necessarily on that moment back in '92, but whether or not the kind of what the balance is like in the UK now, and whether students, whether it's right that students here don't have some of the same diversity of pathways that people do, for example, in the US, maybe also in Germany. This is not an area, this particular area is not my expertise, but I just thought it was an interesting question.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Phil?
It's a great pleasure to be able to put Dr. Bassett on the spot again.
Not for me.
My question is, in fact, the opposite of what Eli was just mentioning, which is how do we protect and advance research universities, which are, of course, a small part of a diversified higher education system, but in my view, a very necessary part, maybe especially in countries like regions like Africa, which are just sort of joining the global knowledge economy. And they're a tough sell in the context of all the things that you've been correctly describing. So if you could maybe discuss that a little bit. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Just the two, Ellen?
Yeah, let's just take those.
Okay.
They're quite, as Phil says, an opposite, but they're all part of the issue of the tertiary system.
Yeah, that's great. So to Eli's question, as Ellen mentioned at the beginning, I used to teach at the University of Southampton. And when I moved to the UK, I learned very quickly about the transformation of the polytechnics into universities. And I think Ellen brought it up, I'm not sure if you did in your question, but this question of convergence is a very, very important one. And the impact of convergence on diversification of the sector for student choice, right? So what ended up happening, it's not just in the UK, it's everywhere, where institutions started fighting for scarce resources. There was mission creep, so that all of them would look as similar as possible. Right? They're all going to be research intensive. The Research Excellence Initiative actually really pushed that as well in the UK, taking away, I think, a very important element of a healthy tertiary education sector, which is really teacher-driven institutions. Something you didn't mention, but I think is really important as well, was the introduction of tuition fees in the UK, which also led to some competition around what is the product being delivered. And I know this is a very loaded term, but what is the education being delivered to students and what is its monetary value, which changed the relationship of students to institution and their own investment. And it also led institutions to all try to appear to be research intensive, world-class institutions to validate the cost, where they all converged again around the same tuition cost. I do think the UK would benefit from a more engaged conversation about student choice and student needs, and if the sector is actually as agile as it could be for students at every possible sort of stage of their commitment to tertiary education. Not every student wants to go to a world-class research university. It's an aspiration for some. It's just too much work, or it's not closely related to their interests, or it's not closely related to their work lives or what they can manage. I mean, there's so much diversity in the student experience. The institutions would be much better serving their societies if it also reflected that same level of diversity. So, I'm sure British scholars on higher education could come back and say why that was a very logical choice at the time, but I do think it took away a lot of agility in this sector to meet the needs of students at different places and different stages through a lifelong learning environment. The Open University being the big exception, I think, to that. And for Phil, I mean, you could answer this question too. We actually don't find in World Bank's work that our clients are seeking to move away from research universities. And in fact, in most of the projects that I either am leading or peer review on, most of the countries are investing in their research universities. They want to be in the rankings. They want to appear as solid partners to international partnerships. They want to be seen as equals in the knowledge economy space. And for that, they need to invest in research universities. We come in and say, that's great. I think there's no question every country deserves and should have the higher education institutions that they wish. And every country, as Phil has said in many lectures and in his writing, every country wants its flagship university to be a world-class or as great as it can possibly be. The noise for us in the higher education or the tertiary education systems discussion is, how do we encourage our clients to seek alternate forms besides the research university? So I think in wealthy countries in the US and Europe, and we'll see public pressure shifting because of financing almost as much as anything else to what is the least we could pay to what is the least that society could pay from a public policy space. How can we diminish how much public spending goes in, because the private returns seem so high to those graduates? And there needs to be, I think, I know I've heard this from many people participating today, a more robust preemptive argument provided by universities on their social value and the return on investment to the institutions for their society, so that when fiscal decisions are being made on how to invest in public higher education, that those are being made really recognizing the value of that investment, the return on every dollar or every pound spent, because tertiary education institutions return significantly more than they cost, and public spending often doesn't reflect that reality.
Okay, thank you very much, Roberta. So then we have a couple of questions, really. I expect looking at management. I'm sorry I didn't give you a heads up. Got focused on the chat line and so on. So Diana and Eileen, Lorelei and Diana Kennedy, you both had kind of questions around governance and management and digitalization and so on. And I wonder if you might ask your questions. Diana?
Thank you, Ellen. Yes, well, thank you, Roberta. It was undoubtedly an inspirational lecture, and it's important for us to have those aspirational ideas about what we should be aiming for. But the practicality of actually doing those things is the thing that concerns me. And just reflecting on what I noticed one of your slides mentioned about the importance of governance being adaptive. And I just wonder, reflecting over the last year, how adaptive have university systems of governance and management been, and not just over the last year, but ever, really, in the sense of responding to need in an effective way? Whereas when you think about what individual academics have been doing, they've been exemplary in the way in which they've adapted what they do, what they teach, how they research, what the research is doing, and so on over the past year. How much do our governance systems contribute to our ability to adapt, do you think?
Yeah, good question, Diane. I did a survey in the Irish case, and the percentage of academics thought that their management leadership had a very poor ability to respond to forthcoming challenges. So that's a kind of interesting comment.
Useful facts, thank you.
Yes, useful facts, absolutely. Eileen, can I ask you, Eileen Kennedy? Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Hi. Just maybe to follow on from that, I wondered if there was room for a little bit more optimism about the capacity of higher education, particularly in Africa, to provide or to increase equity and quality higher education through digitalization. I mean, I've been working with PASCA, which is an organization in Kenya, to convene the leaders of digital education in Kenya. We've had 2 sessions, third one's this week, and we've had 47, I think, institutions coming together to debate, their vision for digital higher education in Kenya. And they have been inspiring. I mean, they're all very, very concerned about issues to do with equity, but they've got solutions. And one of their solutions is to work better with each other and other partners. And you mentioned just now, mobile Wi-Fi providers, internet providers. And it just strikes me that one of the ideas that came up, for instance, was having blended learning hubs in remote areas where people could go and access digital education then. And that's an idea that I've seen in the literature a couple of times. But, before this year, people just didn't believe that it could be possible. After this year, people do. And I just think that there's a year after the sort of initial lockdowns, we've got to a stage where people can have that frank look at how universities responded, as the universities in Kenya are doing, and really start to build a different vision for higher digitalized higher education that could provide that equity that we're looking for. So I don't know what my question quite is, but I just wonder if some of those
I understand.
might be a bit more optimistic than you allow for.
I'll start with that question because maybe I seemed more pessimistic. I mean, it was really, I think the dialogue has gone way over, this is going to solve every problem. And I was trying to pull it back a bit and say, it's not going to solve every problem. But I agree with you completely. I think there is huge space for digital and digitalization technology to play a massive role, especially in our poorest countries, particularly as you described, that there is space to restructure high schools in the evenings all across the countries, right? To use those same spaces that have been used in other countries as 24-hour learning centers, as places where digital, you could access a class being taught in Nairobi, somewhere in the countryside. There's no question about it. The future is digital in higher education. The question really is, in what form, and is it really going to be instead of bricks and mortar teaching? And I don't think there will be any instead of. I think it will be in addition to. I think blended learning absolutely is what's going to come. That we will not see 1,000 people sitting in a lecture hall, both because of COVID, nobody wants to sit with 1,000 people in a lecture hall anymore. And also it's just not an effective way of teaching. Blended learning asynchronous delivery of lectures, things like that, for sure. I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think that's a huge equity driver, as long as it's accompanied by all those things that I said are often missing, which is consistent power, which is infrastructure, which is all of those things that remote rural communities, poor urban environments often don't have. So my point really was, it's not changing tomorrow, and it won't be different next year. We won't see great equity shifts in 5 years, but I think 10, 20 years, when we really could get good data on what's happening, I agree with you completely. There's no lack of energy around it. I just don't think it's going to be as rapidly transformative, and certainly not for equity as people think it will be in the immediate aftermath of COVID. So we're agreeing. I just think it's yeah, we're agreeing.
That's made me feel a lot better. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of governance, I could not agree more. I think the governance space is probably the least agile space in the higher education management environment, although I think quality assurance is also a major challenge. Many countries don't have the ability in the quality assurance frameworks that they have to accept online delivery, especially cross-border online delivery. And so we've been working, as I'm sure many of you have, to quickly adapt quality assurance mechanisms to accept cross-border online delivery, do rapid assessments of whether those are legitimate programs, because we also saw some maybe shady practices of providers coming in and offering online courses that actually weren't of great quality, but in desperation, systems were grabbing onto some of these courses, and quality assurance needs to come in to protect and also to serve, right, the communities that are embracing these changes. But I think the university structures, especially in many of the countries, the wealthier countries, are so rigid, rigidly defined by legislature, rigidly managed by their leadership, that pressure from the academic staff will have to play a huge role. But also, the marketplace will play an intense role on this. If institutions are just not able to deliver agile programs for a changing idea of what they should be doing and meeting the needs of both their academic staff and their students, there will be huge pressure, and they will seem actually just out of touch. They won't seem quite as modern. So the most elite institutions will do fine in all of this. But as Ellen said, I'm teaching at Harvard's Graduate School of Education this year, and that the administration of the ed school, to me, they hired a person living in Switzerland to teach a course to students around the world at an institution based in Boston. They were thinking very fast about how they could create programs, not just deliver remotely, but create whole programs that were inclusive of this changed environment. And it can be done, but I agree completely. This is going to be the slowest part of turning the ship, is going to be changing how governance works.
Okay, thanks there, Roberta. Just coming up, a few questions at the end. We have someone going by the initials FSB. So do you want to ask your question? Maybe say what your name is. Philip.
Yeah. Sorry, my name got changed. But anyways,
okay.
I'm basically asking about financialization. The pandemic has highlighted the fact that the funding models of higher education need some rethinking, maybe. And we can see how different units in the university are now really affected by this sort of logic that has come from financialization. And so I think you kind of understand the question. I'm wondering what is your understanding of the World Bank's thinking in this area, and how is higher education going to deal with this issue, and particularly with the issue of debt financing and the rising institutional debt in the sector, in order to improve, to progress and improve its own systems and structures, and also in relation to the global problems of the day, from inequality to climate change and so on. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And I might just then just add, because you are talking about the bank, and maybe as a final question to add in, if Ijaz Ahmad is there from Pakistan, he wanted to ask a question. So if we might just, so we've gone from very high level to country specific around. We've had a big tour de force there, Roberta. So I'm not sure if he's there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, there you are. I just see a chair. Ah, there you are. Okay.
My question was about what World Bank proposes to country like Pakistan, where access to higher education is very low. But on the other hand, job opportunities are also very low. So regulators are thinking that the access is sufficient because of low job opportunities. And also in recent years, the regulators have started promoting postgraduate education, especially doctoral education. And some academics, they believe that it is because of the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. So I'm wondering what is the World Bank's policy regarding access and postgraduate education in countries like Pakistan?
Thank you. Okay, well, yeah, so we'll wrap up talking about the bank. So as I mentioned in my talk, when we craft projects with our client countries, we actually go in only on the invitation of the country, and we go in when they have asked us explicitly to address a question or a problem. In many cases, it is, we don't see returns from our higher education graduates. We'd like to understand better if our higher education sector is serving the needs, et cetera. So we go in and we do analytical work to really assess any gaps that we recognize, any in terms of global norms. Are we missing anything in the policy structures? Are we missing anything in the financing structures? And so we look at all of that. I will say at no point, and I can say this because I get to really play a big part in establishing this narrative, we would never encourage a country to minimize or unnaturally exclude students from tertiary education. This is not, I think it's an unsustainable and it's an unfortunate practice when it happens, because it presumes that those who are accessing higher education or post-secondary education are the only ones who are right for it, or they're capturing what they need from those who are accessing it. And we know for a fact that that's not the case. We know that access is determined, especially in the lowest income countries around the world, by the wealthiest people in those countries, the wealthiest students, those who access tutoring, those who go to private primary and secondary, and then go to public university afterwards because they had the best score on the entrance exams. There is some fundamental inequality by assuming that current access levels are serving society in the best possible way. So one of many things needs to happen in that space. It can be just a healthier assessment of students that doesn't assume a meritocratic process with a single exit exam or a single entry exam, but instead looks more holistically at the student and their potential. But the World Bank's position would never be that you need to, because job opportunities are low, you should undereducate your population. And I say this because all that does is create a cycle of poverty at the national level that becomes, there are countries with very high proportions of well-educated, 40, 50, 60% of the adult population with advanced post-secondary education. Other countries without. It creates a perpetual space of equity gaps between countries. And so when I said this, when I said I'm not just interested, we are not just interested in the student equity gap, that there's whether or not the lowest quintile student and the highest quintile student are accessing higher education the same. I am also interested in what happens at the national levels, the international levels. What keeps countries from developing so that they can compete and exist and have robust economies compared to wealthier countries? It can very much be that they cannot or are not educating their population as far as the talent allows them to go. And so there needs to be acceptance of a gap space where there are more graduates than jobs. That is a natural occurrence because you're sending graduates out, but then you can encourage through tax policies or banking policies, lending policies, entrepreneurial behaviors that allow for a more robust job creation space by these graduates. But obviously it would not be immediate. You wouldn't see graduates immediately leading to this massively expanded economy. It has to catch up. But we do know that foreign direct investment increases when tertiary education graduate numbers increase as well. If you have an educated population, people are going to be looking for places to invest and build, especially as the economy shifts globally. So when certain countries become too expensive for certain jobs, they move to other countries, right? But that's part of the cycle as well. So
I'm going to
in terms of
Roberta,
postgraduate education, I'm just
I'm
going to do one quick thing. We don't do that either.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off because the clock is going to come down on us and we have the next. So Philip, if I'm really sorry, we're not going to get to your question. I'm going to have to
do it in
be
the breakout room though. It can do it in the breakout room.
Exactly. So what I wanted to say is that the links are up there now, either for the main session, if you want to go in there and hear Chris Millwall and his keynote, or continue this conversation with Roberta in the breakout room, and we'll see you there. Thank you all for attending, and best wishes for you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roberta.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks.